What is the Seven Mountains Mandate? Is it a conservative evangelical plan to Christianize America and end democracy as we know it? Check this out. This is TenOnReligion. Hey peeps, it's Dr. B with TenOnReligion. If you like religion and philosophy content, one thing I really need you to do is to smash that sub button because it really helps out the channel. Also, if you find this content interesting, drop me a super thanks here on YouTube. The transcript is available at TenOnReligion.com and new episodes are on the way, so drop me some views. Today we're talking about a book by Matthew Boedy, a professor at the University of North Georgia, who was targeted by Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA organization back in 2016 and added to its professor watch list. The book is titled The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. Many of you are of course aware of Project 2025, whose supporters want to erase what they see as a decades-long political and social weaponization of government against conservative values. But government is just one of seven mountains of culture the movement wants to radically change. That more expansive strategy is grounded in an ideology called Christian nationalism. Supporters of the mandate are currently using and even abusing the levers of democratic power to deliver on all the movement has been promising. We're going to first introduce the background of the seven mountains and then briefly talk about each of them. The seven mountains are the mountain of education, government, religion, family, business, media, and entertainment. Let's get into it. In 1975, conservative evangelical Christians Bill Bright and Lauren Cunningham met in Colorado and shared similar lists of seven influential areas of culture which needed to be won in order for Christians to take over American society. Over the years, these were called gates, pillars, channels, and now more recently, mountains. The 2021 insurrection made a wider subset of Americans aware of the anti-democratic violence within that ideology, which is now associated with Christian nationalism. They hold the view that the United States was founded by and for Christians. Even though anyone who has seriously studied American history know that this isn't true, that founding mythology pushes many advocates of the Seven Mountains movement to demand that only Christians will have full voting rights in a nation run by the mandate. Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA's organization was remade as a national political organization to conquer the seven mountains. Some called him the new Rush Limbaugh, and because of that, a lot of this book focuses on Turning Point. The goal of Christianizing America is not focused on mass conversions like the Billy Graham crusades of the previous century, but rather to change culture through the seven mountains or cultural domains, and thus they are a threat to the religious pluralism American democracy was built on. They believe they are God's chosen rulers, and that political and social victories should lead, as in come before, spiritual goals. Back in the mid-1900s, fundamentalists as a sect were derided in movies such as the 1960 film Inherit the Wind, which dramatized the 1925 Scopes trial. But this started to change in the 1970s with Bill Bright's organization Campus Crusade for Christ and Lauren Cunningham's organization Youth with a Mission. The culture they were countering was the original counterculture movement that brought America Woodstock, second wave feminism, and the sexual revolution, as well as other events and trends in the late 1960s. Cunningham wrote that Satan's authority over the world needed to be ousted. This kind of spiritual war rhetoric started to grow in some evangelical circles. Then in the past few decades came the growth of Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA organization, even including Ginny Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who was an early Turning Point board member. Its political arm, Turning Point Action, began in late 2019 and by 2020 was running a highly sophisticated social media campaign that downplayed the COVID pandemic and sowed doubt about the upcoming election. Since embracing the Seven Mountains movement, Turning Point is no longer merely a youth-oriented movement. It has an army of staff in every major city to reach all ages. Now let's get into the first mountain, the mountain of education. Charlie Kirk hated higher education, all public education in fact, because he believed that as a system from start to finish, from kindergarten to college degree, it indoctrinates students against God and against his vision of a conservative America. So the goal is not persuasion of public education, but punishment. The vision is for a righteous minority to gain power. Ever since Brown versus Board of Education ordered the desegregation of schools in 1954, white conservative Christians have continued to create a parallel education system to avoid integration. White conservative Christians defined education as primarily religious, and that any curriculum not grounded specifically in Christianity was not merely secular, but anti-Christian, because for them there is no such thing as religiously neutral public education. In April 2012, during his senior year in a suburban Chicago public high school in Wheeling, Kirk wrote an article for the alt-right site Breitbart in which he accused his teachers of liberal indoctrination. Apparently, his AP economics textbook didn't give enough space to his favorite conservative economic theories, and so he thought it was propaganda. Kirk wrote another article in June 2012 about Obama and the youth vote. By July, he was on Fox News. Kirk founded Turning Point that summer. If local school boards, administrators, librarians, and of course teachers won't educate God's way, then Kirk and Turning Point will bring God's judgment upon them. That judgment aims to purify education and return the nation's public schools to their colonial roots, and so to build God's kingdom through God's pedagogy. This is motivated by a sense of loss of evangelical Christians being the majority religion and influence in society. Turning Point started both a professor and school board watch list, which calls out individuals which either oversee or teach, quote, radical indoctrination of our children in the classroom, end quote. These efforts seek to harass and expel educators and discourage people willing to be teachers, and in some cases motivated violence. In October 2023, 2 Turning Point employees assaulted an Arizona State University professor because of the professor's pro-LGBTQ policies. They were subsequently arrested and pled guilty in April 2024. The author of this book argues that this is not democracy, though. American democracy is the informed debate about policies and values, especially in a religiously pluralistic society. This is why education matters in a democracy. Not surprisingly, Turning Point hasn't centered democracy in its attack on education, and this is pretty intentional. The second mountain is the mountain of government. Since the 1970s, white evangelicals have argued for a massive reduction in the size of the federal government. They have argued that our Constitution calls for more state power. And of course, in American history, states' rights have been a pretext for oppression of racial minorities. They want to undermine the role of the federal government to smooth the way for the installation of biblical governments across America. This vision is an America not merely grounded in Christian values, but governed directly by Christians. In 2023, Marjorie Taylor Greene went on Charlie Kirk's radio show and said that the way forward for the nation was to destroy democracy. This is a theological position held by many conservative evangelicals that red states are threatened by an offensive attack by the demonic force of blue states. It is intentionally communicated in the language of spiritual warfare to emotionally stir up their followers. The goal is to destroy democracy for God. Democracy is bad because it replaced God with humans as the central authority. Kirk's Turning Point organization has been a huge influence upon evangelicals in America. Turning Point's plan to Christianize America means spending millions to reshape territory it already owns and spreading from there. Conservatives are easy targets for the anti-democratic movement since they are often led by leaders who propelled the election lies and the subsequent 2021 insurrection. Kirk and Turning Point convinced leaders in red states that their hold on power was threatened and that blue states and blue cities were coming for them. Rob McCoy of Calvary Chapel in California stated that God's law was for all, not just for Christians. For McCoy and Kirk, we the people stands for the white evangelical church. They therefore can ignore any law, ordinance, or even policy they find tyrannical as an anti-white Christian nationalism. Christians in blue states should ignore certain laws, while Christians in red states should shape the laws for all the citizens within their borders. The source of authority for government is the church. Religious pluralism is seriously threatened in this model, and religious toleration is neither possible nor desirable. In the eyes of white Christian nationalism and its followers, the power of governmental consent needs to be systematically removed from those unworthy in their eyes to give it. In a democracy, you can't love your country only when you win, but that's exactly what the mandate of the mountain of government emulates. The third mountain is the mountain of religion, which is the biggest mountain of them all. The 2021 riot on the U.S. Capitol was not merely the effect of lies about the 2020 election, but the decades-long influence of the Seven Mountains Mandate. The mountain of religion is central to the rise of the Mandate movement. The movement wants to purify the church from demonic influences, make it more willing to act as the nation's moral enforcer, and make it more militant in that action. This claim was born in traditionally white churches within American evangelicalism, whose conservative theology often saw mainline denominations as culturally corrupt and historic black churches as theologically suspect. Thus, white Christian nationalism needs to persevere based on a very specific interpretation of the Bible and Christian faith. The Seven Mountains movement had turned the cultural mandate for their biblical worldview to win into a cultural war. That war came by pushing the concept of spiritual warfare from the margins of American Christianity into wider usage. Getting liberty right to leaders of the Seven Mountains Mandate movement, including the late Charlie Kirk, both meant and means advancing myths about American history. Turning Point offers pastors training in how to preach about the Constitution. Kirk often repeated debunked claims about colonial American history. As they work to persuade evangelical leaders, Turning Point is also aiming to convince not just church leaders, but congregants. It is radicalizing civic training in evangelical churches to put the Civil War of politics directly in the pew. Turning Point partnered with a group called Patriot Academy, which even included combat-focused pistol training. In the summer of 2024, Turning Point and Patriot Academy also partnered on a series of trainings for teens and young adults called Leadership Congress. The training is designed to mimic the work of legislative bodies so they know how to introduce bills in government settings. Dominion is a theological principle that unites the movement. The leaders of the movement want to use democracy to initially assert itself, then, if necessary, implement extra constitutional control. The Seven Mountains movement leaders also want the secular city council to be outed and replaced by church leaders governing at the city level. This kind of talk often raises fears of theocracy. The plan is a rule by Christians and Christianity. Such a government system would privilege Christianity even if the majority are not Christians. When Kirk spoke of religious freedom, he hardly ever mentioned other religions outside of Protestant sects, because he held a myth that most founders were conservative Protestant Christians, which wasn't the case. Kirk's understanding of the freedom of religion clause in the Bill of Rights meant that the government would not choose favorites among Protestant sects. American laws, as modeled from Christian scriptures, should guide us all toward the spiritual freedom from sin offered by God through Christianity. But if citizenship is both constitutional and biblical, who gets to be a citizen in such a society? The fourth mountain is the mountain of family. Turning Point bills itself as a form of cultural law enforcement, and as with reclaiming the education mountain, such enforcement does not merely mean persuasion, but punishment. In the Seven Mountains movement's plan for the mountain of family, the masculine heart is called into action as a kind of national moral guard for America. The mandate also aims to convince women to fashion themselves as spiritually minded homemakers, because the most valuable roles for women are as wives and mothers. To conquer the mountain of family, they need husbands who will become key leaders on the other mountains. To strengthen the family means to attack those who supposedly weaken the institution of marriage by embodying alternatives to one man, one woman partnership. They want to ban all other relationship forms, especially those represented as LGBT and other related gender identifications. When speaking to an evangelical audience in Arizona in 2024, Kirk said that evangelicals should never have allowed gay marriage to happen. American evangelical men are pictured as fighters, warriors, and mountain climbers, both metaphorical and literal. As Turning Point aims to create real men in response to the rise of feminism, it is also teaching women how to be real women. It's like a wife in a dress and apron feeding dinner to a husband in a 1950s setting. Women can get involved in business and politics as long as she has the approval of her husband to do so. Both husband and wife must protect their children, specifically daughters. This call to protect daughters is part of a larger move by conservatives to demonize trans people and enforce a binary understanding of gender, while also promoting men as aggressive protectors of women. And most importantly, women must always vote, because righteous candidates need every vote. How the family should be ruled is how the nation should be ruled. This is why the mandate movement is a danger to democracy. It seeks to silence, erase, and eliminate a number of important voices. The fifth mountain is the mountain of business. Why business? Because money is needed for a spiritual war. Conquering the mountain of business means fulfilling the prophecy spread by the mandate movement called the Great Transfer of Wealth. This is when God takes wealth from the evil rich and gives it to his remnant of true followers who will use their new financial power for God's agenda. Socialism must be deposed as a demon atop the mountain of business. Why socialism? Because they believe it is anti-Christian, despite, of course, all those verses where Jesus talked about helping the poor. God wants capitalism as America's economic system. The theology behind the Seven Mountains movement's call for wealth creation is the prosperity gospel. This is made prominent by televangelists like Kenneth Copeland, Oral Roberts, and later Benny Hinn and Creflo Dollar, who taught different versions of the claim that God will financially bless his believers. It took off because the prosperity gospel's promised individual wealth works in tandem with free market capitalism. It was an enticement to leaders in a sphere where money was godly money needed for the conquest of the other mountains. In a world where the wealth of Christian nationalism is aimed at every sphere of influence, each success of the movement comes with a significant cost to democracy. Democracies die when the elite use their money-made power to oppress others. The sixth mountain is the mountain of media. Since the 1800s, a significant segment of American evangelicalism was devoted to an end times theology known as dispensationalism, named for the ways it divides eras of history into dispensations where God deals with humanity in these different eras in different ways. Using a literal interpretation of the Bible, John Nelson Darby developed dispensationalism in the 1800s. Later, the Scofield Bible, published in 1909, garnered lots of attention in evangelicalism during the early decades of the 20th century because of how it presented the darkness of the last days. In some versions of this, Christians would be raptured away to heaven while the rest of the world would descend into chaos. Why might this matter in a chapter on the mountain of media? Evangelical leaders taught Christians to see through the headlines and understand the times, and to use the Bible to interpret the news as if Bible passages were talking about contemporary events today, which they obviously weren't. So the plan to Christianize America and destroy democracy begins with developing a highly tuned conspiracy radar. Spiritual paranoia, to think all the time as if there is a conspiracy against God, is what drives the Seven Mountains mandate. A conspiracy mindset is what unites these people, but it is also what destroys democracy because it removes them from any broader community conversation. The mainstream media doesn't tell you the whole story, they say. Those media outlets have an agenda and they don't know God. Amid the mass media ecosphere fragmenting into niche audiences, conservative bubbles have hardened over the years into the enclaves of lies and outrage. They splintered off from Fox News and the remnants of Rush Limbaugh's decades-long conservative radio show. The media is a secular force because it uses science, reason, and facts to speak authoritatively about the reality of the world, effectively replacing religious truth-tellers with media voices. Thus, the mass media is part of an anti-Christian conspiracy. Turning Point also works to maintain audience interests in specific conspiracies by framing them as having anti-Christian goals. The problem is, pumping one specific conspiracy too long runs counter to the larger strategy. One must invent new examples to keep the focus on conspiracy. To maintain the threat of danger, new dangers must abound. People must be kept afraid to keep them motivated towards the conservative cause. In short, conspiracy as strategy leaves no way to unify around shared American ideals, nor any way to deliberate about them in new and helpful ways. One cannot effectively engage with others when one is always in fear of the other. And last, the seventh mountain of entertainment. This chapter was interesting, but we're running out of time, so let me summarize it a little more succinctly. The entertainment strategy is similar to its strategy for the mountain of family. Erase that which isn't agreeable to its ideology. This erasure happens through belittling political opponents so they think twice about participating in democratic arenas through entertainment, including woke athletes and even woke sports. There is framing of a war against the left, which controls entertainment and pop culture, and the development of the uses of memes, such as Own the Libs. It sees entertainment as politics, rather than viewing our democracy as a culture of community. Again, notice that we is intentionally defined very narrowly here. You can always tell a lot about a person by who is included when they use the word we. So what is this really all about? The seven mountains arose out of fear. Fear of people who are different. Fear of losing identity. Fear of loss of control. But it doesn't have to be viewed in those terms. The only way out is through. We must create communities road by road at the local level which sustain the core elements of democracy. Wouldn't it be better to contribute to society by creating a larger shared identity rather than splinter off and create a minority with an elitist mindset? We don't do this with food, for example. There are all sorts of international options available which contribute to the larger whole. Why be so exclusive in governing society based on one narrow interpretation of one religion? It doesn't reflect the true nature of a globalized world and creates more tension than it resolves. So what did you think about Matthew Boedy's book, The Seven Mountains Mandate? Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought about this book. I hope you were able to better understand the conservative evangelical plan from this short presentation. And again, if this was in any way helpful, drop me a super thanks. Until next time, stay curious. If you enjoyed this, support the channel in the link below. Please like and share this video and subscribe to this channel. This is TenOnReligion.